From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden welcomes NATO members to Washington in a forceful speech, but will it calm Democratic fears over Biden's age and condition? Meantime, the White House spars with the press about which doctors Biden has seen and when, as Speaker Mike Johnson raises the prospect of invoking the 25th Amendment if the president isn't up to the job. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua and columnist Kim Strassel. On Tuesday evening, at the opening of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's annual summit, President Biden awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and recognized the alliance's 75th anniversary. Here's a piece of what he said.
Before this war, Putin thought NATO would break. Today, NATO is stronger than it's ever been in its history. When this senseless war began, Ukraine was a free country. Today, it is still a free country, and the war will end with Ukraine remaining a free and independent country. Russia will not prevail. Ukraine will prevail.
President Biden also announced additional air defenses will be going to Ukraine. This was one day after a Russian barrage on Monday that, according to the Journal story, was the largest missile attack in months, including a strike on a children's hospital in Kyiv. Let's listen to what President Biden said there.
Today, I'm announcing an historic donation of air defense equipment for Ukraine. The United States, Germany, the Netherlands, Romania, and Italy will provide Ukraine with the equipment for 5 additional strategic air defense systems. And in the coming months, the United States and our partners intend to provide Ukraine with dozens of additional tactical air defense systems. The United States will make sure that when we export critical air defense interceptors, Ukraine goes to the front of the line.
Monet, part of the focus for the press and commentary is going to be on President Biden's performance there and whether it will calm Democratic fears. George Clooney, the actor, up with an op-ed today saying that the Joe Biden he saw recently at a fundraiser was the same man we all witnessed at the debate. But the man up on the NATO stage there sounded more like the fiery Joe Biden from the State of the Union address this year. So what do you think? Does this performance, as the White House I'm sure hopes, will this performance calm any Democratic fears?
Well, I think it's almost certain that it's not going to calm anybody, and that's because what we saw from Biden in his NATO address was what we've seen from him a lot over the past few months. He is able to perform when he has a teleprompter in front of him, and he's able to read scripted lines to an audience. That is a completely different task than being able to think and field questions in the moment. And it's frankly a completely different task from being able to make the kinds of live in the moment decisions that the president of the United States actually has to make. It brings me back to the State of the Union address earlier this year, but people have been talking a lot about a press conspiracy to hide Biden's infirmity. And I think part of that conspiracy was the rousing applause and reception that he got after delivering that State of the Union address. You saw a lot of papers coming out and saying, all of these claims that Biden is slipping mentally have been overblown because look at how confidently and firmly he was able to deliver this detailed policy address. But of course, in that speech, just like with the NATO speech, he had a teleprompter in front of him. And so I think people are aware of this distinction by now. I actually saw a report from Reuters in which they interviewed an anonymous diplomat who was in the room for that speech. And he echoed the idea that it wasn't going to reassure anyone about Biden's faculties. So that's not just true among Democrats debating Biden's candidacy in the United States. Even people overseas saw the debate, understand the position that Biden is in mentally, and have a much higher bar for him to be able to prove that he actually has the mental capacity to run and win and to govern for another 4 years.
Kim, there's also now new controversy about visits, according to the White House visitor logs, by a neurological specialist and what he was doing there at the White House. Let's listen to a clip of the recent White House press briefing where Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre is tangling about this with CBS's Ed O'Keefe.
We cannot share names. There are security reasons. We have to protect. I understand that. I hear you.
It's right there for anyone to see.
Ed, I hear you. I cannot from here confirm any of that because we have to keep their privacy. I think they would appreciate that too. We have to give them.
Patient or the doctor?
We have to keep their privacy.
It is public.
It's public information.
I hear you.
listed that he went
And you're going to allow this to fester longer, Kareem, unless the White House answers the
hold on a second. There's no reason to go back and forth and be in this aggressive way.
Miffed around here about how information's been shared with the press corps about him.
What do you missed about? What do you missed
Everything
about?
he just asked about.
And then every time I come back and I answer the question that you guys
answered it
asked.
correctly, didn't have to come back and clean it up.
I never answered the question incorrectly.
Kim, what's going on here?
Well, a lot's going on here. Here's the backstory: is the press got interested suddenly in who had been going to the White House from a medical capacity. People asked for visitors logs. And what showed up is that a neurological specialist, a doctor who in fact is the longest serving neurologist at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. He's also a specialist in movement disorders, has done a paper on Parkinson's disease, that he had visited the White House 8 times over the past year from last July until March. And he might have even visited more, but under the way things work, his name wouldn't have appeared in more recent visitor logs. So at least 8 times. And the press wanted to know what this was about. And for a while, they refused to answer questions. The White House did. Finally, on Monday night, the White House physician, Kevin O'Connor, issued a statement explaining who Dr. Kennard was. That's his name, Dr. Kevin Kennard. And noted that he had come to the White House as many times. He said that he had been part of the president's annual physical every year. The president's had 3 of those since he's been in office. As we know, the White House physician has always explained that he's fit for duty, no problems. We got a little bit more information in that letter. We now find that a number of specialists also sit in on this physical, optometry, cardiac, all the different specialties out there, and that he had come in as part of this. He implied, Dr. Kevin O'Connor, the White House physician, that, and he didn't say it specifically, that any other visits that Dr. Kennard had made to the White House were in aid of regular neurological clinics that support other active duty military people who serve the White House. He also added, and I think this was a key point, quote, President Biden has not seen a neurologist outside of his annual physical, end quote. And that raises a lot of questions to me. I think if that point is true, and that if indeed during his physical he has not been given as part of that the sort of test that you get if you go to see a neurologist to test for your cognitive ability or dementia, those are basic standard things. A lot of us have had older relatives in our lives. When you begin to notice some slippage, it is the right thing to do. You get them to a doctor. You have one of these tests done just to rule out that there is any problem. If that has not happened with Biden, and the White House has refused to clarify that point as to how in-depth this annual physical has gone. I would note, though, that when Joe Biden sat with George Stephanopoulos, he was asked if he'd had a cognitive test, and he refused to answer, simply responding every time, I have a cognitive test every day of my job, which would suggest that he has not, in fact. And I think that this has all raised a lot of questions about why not. Again, this is a standard thing for older Americans, and it's raising a lot of questions about the doctors' roles here.
Hang tight, we'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Kim raised some interesting points before the break. I agree. I was also struck by the president's answer in that George Stephanopoulos interview when he was asked, have you done a cognitive test? Would you commit to doing a cognitive test? And he all but said no. He said that I'm tested every day. And it raises the question in my mind, Monet, whether there's an element of not wanting to know the answers, at least on the president's behalf, if not on the behalf of his family and his advisors. And I would point to one of these cognitive tests that's floating around. This is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. And just to give an example of some of the things it asks. So draw a clock face that shows 10 past 11. Can you name these animals? And there are cartoons of a lion and a rhinoceros and a camel. Repeat these numbers after the doctor says them. 21854. Okay, now can you do these numbers backwards? 742. It's things like that. So this is not a test that should be difficult for anyone who is not suffering the effects of dementia or some kind of cognitive impairment, which is one reason I always laugh somewhat when President Trump brags about how he aced these tests. It's like, congratulations, you can identify a cartoon of a lion. But Monet, it is striking then that President Biden is refusing to take this same kind of test, or at least refusing to say whether he has taken one.
Exactly. I think Donald Trump's boasting about acing this test would be hilarious if not for the fact that he is drawing a very real distinction with the current president, whose ability to pass a test like that is definitely not certain. We have seen different kind of cognitive tests from Joe Biden. Obviously, the American people aren't able to see how he comports himself behind closed doors doing the daily work of the president, and he and all of his advisors swear that he's completely sharp and fully alive despite some of the reporting to the contrary. But we do see him whenever he appears in public, and it's very clear that over the past few months he has been slower, slurring his words more, outright forgetting things much more, confusing the names of world leaders in a way that implies that even very simple things like remembering a sequence of numbers in order, of remembering the names of animals, might not be a bar that he could clear. And so it doesn't surprise me that he would avoid taking a formal medical test that could imply that he actually has dementia or some kind of diagnosable condition. I think that from his perspective, the perspective of his family and his advisors, they probably do want to make sure that he's getting care of some kind, hence the visits from these doctors that Kim was mentioning. They're bringing in specialists to consult with him, but I think that they might do that at the same time as not wanting to actually have him diagnosed with any kind of ailment, because they know that once that news breaks, it's only going to add to the American people's concerns about whether he's fit to continue serving. So they're trying to walk a very dangerous line between maybe treating Biden in certain ways without attaching a diagnosis to it that they think would sink his campaign prospects.
Kim, what about the questions on transparency? I put most of the blame here on the principal. And if the principal is refusing to answer these kinds of questions, doesn't want to take the test, maybe doesn't want to know the answers that he suspects the test would provide, it does put his staff and his doctors in a difficult position because they owe an obligation to their patient, to their boss, to their president. And I guess the choice is to continue trying to convince him internally that he needs to do something like this and to try to help him serve in his role, his office, as best as he can, or to resign and go public and say, Mr. President, I can no longer be a part of this. And we should also note, Kim, that this is not the first time that a politician has not been forthcoming about his health. You don't have to go very far to recall presidential candidate Bernie Sanders had a heart attack and put out a doctor's note saying he was all fine, but without the kind of actual information that other cardiology specialists said you would actually need in order to evaluate his condition.
All through history. Look, this has become one of the problems, too, of having these White House physicians that attest to the health of a president. And I apportion only a little blame here to the doctors because really the problem, as you note, Kyle, is the principal. It's the president. And all through history, look, you can go all the way back. I mean, Grover Cleveland had a cancer that was never acknowledged to the public. Woodrow Wilson had a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. It was covered up. FDR had a number of ailments, including congestive heart failure, that was not disclosed. JFK had Addison's disease. I mean, go up to more recently, there's a lot of legitimate questions about whether or not the doctors were transparent about the extent and the severity of Donald Trump's COVID when he had it. Now, the problem, as you say, is that doctors are bound by confidentiality. They're not necessarily allowed to go out and divulge this information because they have a duty to their patient of privacy. You would think and hope that the president would greenlight those doctors to go and be honest to the public. That is, in fact, part of their job, not just to treat the president, to provide some transparency. But we know that that's not the case. Obviously, politics plays a huge aspect of this. All presidents always want to project an image of unfailing health. But I also put some blame here on those around Biden. You're right. You can't make people do this, but where is the family here? Where are the aides who are caring about the president's health and competency, not just his political fortune and his political situation? Because as we know, too, those of us who have dealt with elderly relatives, because they're having a bit of slippage, they're not the people best positioned to make that decision for themselves or to recognize that they need to go and have a test done. So I think there's a lot of failure all around.